All right, let's go ahead and get started. I think for the first few minutes here, I think people will keep joining, and that's fine. So I'm Sean Parkman. I'm the grants manager for the Oregon State Fire Marshal. And we, just to give everyone's a heads up, we're planning on recording this and posting it on our website. So just for everyone's heads up there. The purpose of this presentation is managing risk in grant projects, and this came up as a topic for us. We heard from quite a few of our grantees, some of whom are new to grants, at least of this size, and others that have been doing grants for some time are doing something new for them, whatever that may be. For example, purchasing some larger equipment or something like that. And some questions started coming up in different ways and over time around risk management and insurance and this kind of thing. And so we asked our very own Joseph Wandabwa, OSFM's legal and risk manager, to help us out and give us a presentation on some of these topics and run us through some highlights of some things to consider. Joseph's going to mention this, but I'll mention it anyway. The purpose of this is not to provide direct legal advice from our organization to yours, but rather just go over some general topics for you to consider and think about and do some investigation on your side. But really to get sort of demystify some of the topics, as some of them are pretty manageable if you just have a plan. So that's our general idea here. I think our plan is to have some room for questions and answers at the end if you want to save your questions to the end or drop them in the chat. We'll be monitoring them as we go along. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joseph. Take it away.
And thank you, Sean. I'll just make this bigger. Sorry. My name is Joseph Wandabwa. I am the legal and risk manager here at OSFM. Just to emphasize what Sean has said, this is not in any way providing legal advice to you or your organization, because we know situations are specific, and in case you do require some kind of legal advice, it would be appropriate to seek probably advice from a lawyer, where you would address your concerns, and the lawyer would be able to give you competent legal advice. But for today, I just want to go through basics of risk management, especially to you, organizations and agencies that do a very important role of keeping our communities safe. It's important that you know what you may do or steps that you may undertake to mitigate some of the risks to enable you achieve the goals of the grant. And so I wanted us to first begin by reminding ourselves of what this grant was all about. This was a competitive grant. As you all know, you went through a process. It was open to local governments, special districts, structure, fire service agencies, and non-government organizations. The purpose of the fund was basically to enable you pursue those projects within the communities that would help reduce or prepare communities for wildfires. And of course, the project in itself, the grants had limitations that you all know. But first, this is what was allowed. This is what you would use this grant for. You would engage in projects for vulnerable communities, defensible space programs, community common area projects, education projects, and so on. And among the things that the grant was not meant to be used for was fire suppression, response equipment, personal protective equipment, and prescribed fire bans. Also things like road paving projects. Those were not some of the things that you were required to spend this money on. You're aware that once you receive a grant, it comes with some sort of requirements that you are supposed to undertake, and therefore it's important that you understand what compliance means. And of course, this stems from the agreement that you signed with OSFM while receiving the grant and the proposals that you made. But grant compliance basically means a set of rules and regulations that grantees must adhere to receive and maintain funding from the grantor. The requirements are established by the grantor, and usually at the end of the day, these are reduced into some form of agreement where the grantee and the grantor sign, and that is what guides your relationship throughout the period when you're supposed to utilize the grant. The specific requirements vary from agreement to agreement and between parties, and depending on what negotiations were undertaken and the promises that you made that you would use these funds for, and whatever was finally reduced into agreement is what the grantor, that is OSFM, would expect you to deliver on. And so when we are looking for what has gone wrong or what was not fulfilled, we normally look at the agreement. So what are some of the risks associated with grant funds? First, it's important to understand what a risk is. In ordinary terms, a risk is an event or a condition that could occur, and once it occurs, it may positively or negatively impact on the achievement of your goals. It's a possibility. It may or may not happen, but it's something that you would want to plan for in the event that it actually does happen. Of course, in any organization or entity, whatever, even in our daily lives, we experience so many risks and we live by risk. But what is important is that we undertake measures that are able to mitigate on the risks that may come up. One of the ways of course, knowing what risks you have in your agency is to begin by identifying. You have to use several tools that will enable you know what kinds of risks that your agency or organization is facing. And so you begin by, and identification is simple. It could be as simple as sitting in a room with your employees or workmates and discussing, looking at internal and externally, what is this agency or organization? What kind of risks are being faced by this agency? And then after identifying those risks, you then have to consider the severity of each of the risks that would cause to the agency if it at all happened. And also you have to consider what is the likelihood that that risk will actually happen, and what are the consequences of it happening. And if you consider that this is something that is so impactful that if it happened, it may cripple the objectives or the ability to attain some of the objectives that you've set out to, and that is something that you should pay particular attention to. And then when we come to grants face specific risks that are not really general to all other agencies. So when you are a recipient of a grant, you have certain obligations that you must fulfill. And usually the grantor, that is, in this case, OSFM, expects that whatever you promised that you'd be doing will be done or has been done at the end of that period. So below are some of the risks that you could think about in your organization or agency that you may come across, that the agency may face, which may have an effect on the achievement of some of the proposals that you put forward while you're applying for this grant. So the most common is financial mismanagement, which at times includes poor budgeting, fraud, inaccuracy in financial reporting, and misuse of funds generally. If something like this happened, probably you'll not be able to achieve what you've set out to achieve. And this is a risk that should be of concern to a grantee of funds. There are also compliance and accountability issues, failure to comply with the terms and conditions of the grant agreement. So it's important that you understand what the agreement requires of you so that you can be able to fulfill your obligations under the agreement. We also have operational challenges. Sometimes these come because the agencies do not have the capacity to undertake what they have set out to achieve, or their inefficiencies in their processes that hinder the organization's ability to implement programs. We also have monitoring and evaluation challenges. Usually monitoring helps you track your progress in achieving your goals. And so if there is inadequate monitoring and evaluation, this may prevent the agency or grantee from effectively tracking and assessing the impact of their programs. And usually because we are looking at what projects you're undertaking within the communities and what impacts these projects are causing, especially preparing the communities for wildfires. So if you are not able to track and monitor your progress, then this is a risk that may prevent you from achieving your set out goals. How can grantees recipients implement strategies to reduce risks as they use grant funds? We have a number of strategies that you could undertake to address some of the risks. Remember, once you identify, and identifying begins with assessing, of course, yourself. Once you identify risks within your agency, it is important to treat or have a mechanism of treating those risks. Of course, the approaches to risk management generally about four. You're either avoiding the risk completely. Sometimes this is an option that is not available because you have to undertake the project anyway. So you'll not be able to avoid the risks out there. The other one is probably reducing the loss or preventing the loss that could occur. And then the other one is transferring the risk completely away from your agency. And by transfer here, the common way of transferring risk that we should all be aware is insurance, where you say, in case ABCD happens, the insurance company or whatever will cover the loss. In that way, you are protected. But when it comes to grants, these are some of the strategies that you can use. You can use financial management tools. The grantee may consider establishing financial controls and procedures to ensure proper budget management. You could put in place a compliance oversight. That is, you could appoint an individual or a team that is responsible for ensuring adherence to grant requirements. You could also just communicate with the grantor. Transparent and regular communication with the grantor may help you resolve some of the challenges encountered during this process. But the most important that I should have probably mentioned first is risk assessment. conducting a regular risk assessment helps the grantee establish some of the risks facing the organization that may have an impact on the grant. Risk assessment is a comprehensive process, and sometimes it may require you to bring in a technical person to do the risk assessment. But on a small scale, you can also conduct a risk assessment on your own, because as a team, you can sit and identify, for example, the projects that you're going to undertake and what possibly could go wrong. The question is always, what could go wrong? What harm could arise from anything going wrong? And then, so what steps should we take to prevent that harm from happening, or reducing the impact of the harm to the organization? So on probably a regular basis, if you undertook risk assessment, you will be able to understand the risks that are facing your agency and which will have an impact on the grant. It's also important that you keep records. Documentation can be valuable for audits and compliance, especially if the agreement requires that you do provide, if the agreement requires that an audit will be conducted by the grantor to establish whether these funds are actually being put to the use that it was intended for. And of course, insurance and risk transfer is considered one of the most effective ways or strategies of reducing risks. This is because it carries away your burden and moves it over to a third party. And so you're rest assured that if at all anything happens, the insurer will take care of that. When we come to contractual requirements, sometimes it's important to understand what are your contractual requirements. And I know sometimes challenges arise and there's always confusion about the contract agreement. And of course, some contracts have technical language that may not be able to appreciate or understand from the start. But to avoid all this, it's always important to, from the very start, before you actually sign an agreement, you should review it. And if you believe that you do not understand any of the terms, or the term is not clear, then probably you should seek legal assistance or just ask for clarification. I mean, these contracts are probably drafted by the grantor and sent to you for review and signing. So in case there's a term that is not clear, you can just contact the grantor and ask, what does clause 1 of this agreement mean? Because it doesn't seem clear to me if I can sign. And so seeking guidance from the grantor can always help you understand better and avoid any confusion within the contract. And then we also know that during the process of implementing or pursuing the goals or the obligations and conditions and whatever terms that were set out in the agreement, sometimes circumstances change and you may need to modify, or you may, because you're unable to pursue a certain project, or because it has just become impossible for you to go on with the proposal. So in that case, if ever need arises, I'm sure this is something that is always also embedded within the agreements. If you feel like there's need to change a term, then it's important to identify what is supposed to be modified and then reach out to the grantor and see if it is possible to have the modification to enable you pursue the project and so that both parties are satisfied that the terms of the agreement are being pursued. What kinds of records do you need to save and for how long? Here we are talking about your retention policy. sometimes the retention policy may not align with the requirements of the grant agreement. So, for example, your agency or organization might have a retention policy of 2 years or 5 years, but then you have a grant which is going to run for 6 years. And at the end of the grant, probably the grantor needs evidence that you've actually done what you're supposed to do. So if you destroyed, for example, your records following your agent's policy, you may not be able to comply with the requirements of the agreement. So at the end of the day, the grantor is interested in knowing whether the funds have been used and have been used properly. And the only way to know that is if you are able to produce records to demonstrate that the grant has been used in a manner that was set out in the agreement. And for that, you must keep financial records. These would include expense reports, invoices, receipts, and bank statements. You also have to keep communication records. These usually include emails, letters, meetings. And the importance of this is because out of this communication, sometimes there may be modifications. And so if at all a dispute arose that ABCD was not agreed upon, then you can always refer to those communications that you had with the grantor. Then we also have subcontractor agreements. Sometimes you may receive a grant, but you cannot do everything that you propose to do, and therefore you decide to engage a subcontractor, but then you're using grant funds. So the grantor needs to understand or know where you put all your funds. So if you do not have an agreement with a third party, then you may not be able to account for those funds. So it's important that you also keep the agreements that you have with subcontractors. We also have insurance documents that sometimes the agreement requires to acquire insurance, and therefore you must have evidence of that. The most important part is how do you ensure that you're putting the grant funds to proper use? And where do you look to ensure that this is, first of all, when you applied for the grant, of course, you made a proposal and you stated what you're going to do. And then following that, a review was done and you have deemed your project was deemed viable, and therefore the funds were granted. And this was reduced into an agreement. So your first document to look at if you want to if you intend to comply if you intend to put to proper use the funds that were granted is usually the grant agreement. That grant agreement, I should say, contains the understanding of the parties, that is you, the agencies that took the grant, and OSFM, and therefore it sets out what is supposed to be done. So for you to adhere and put proper use the funds, you first look at the agreement, and then you establish internal controls and conduct internal audits to see whether you're actually doing what you're supposed to be doing. And also because if there are leaks within your internal system, then some funds you may put funds to a use that was not intended for. But if you have internal controls, then it will be like a check, and so you'll be able to at one point understand that, okay, then probably this is not the use that these funds are supposed to be put to, and then correct that immediately, because the audit will tell you that you are not properly using the funds. You can also maintain accurate and detailed records of all expenses related to the grant funds. You have regular financial reporting if this is a requirement under the agreement, but also communicate regularly and transparently with the grantor. If there is something that you need to do, but this is something that was not envisaged within the agreement, then probably communicating with the grantor in seeking a modification to that may help you pursue that project that you think is important to the community. And of course, with the aim of achieving what the grant is set out to do. But also evaluating and monitoring. If you implement a robust monitoring and evaluation system to track the project outcomes, it will ensure alignment with the grant goals. And if you use the evaluation results to make informed decisions, then at the end of the day, you'll be able to achieve and put proper use to the funds that you've been granted. One of the things that I wanted to really emphasize is insurance. Insurance is important because, like I mentioned, is one of the risk control methods that is commonly used. And also because if something happened that caused the agency or organization to suffer such a huge loss that it cannot continue, then we as the grant and the community will definitely lose, because you are unable to pursue the projects that that would be impactful to the communities, especially when it comes to wildfires. So most of the time, the agreements require you to carry out insurance, and there's a reason why, because most of the time we know that it's very hard for an agency or organization to take on the loss alone, especially when it occurs. So in this case, insurance is important, but we cannot really advise on the specifics of what insurance you should be taking out, because each organization varies by size, by project activities, by the type of activity that you're undertaking. And this is advice that you can always just ask your insurance carrier or the Special Districts Association of Oregon, or you can contact DAS Risk Management. They can always advise you on the type of insurance that you would require in your circumstances. But it's important that you are able to have some sort of insurance to cover the agency or your personnel. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is, for example, you know that if you have general liability insurance, it would cover your employees and your staff against your company, your organization against general liability, like tort claims. But did you also know that that kind of insurance doesn't cover volunteers? And so you need to carry out some kind of special insurance for volunteers if you have volunteers within your agency organization, because the volunteers will go and perform tasks on your behalf. And if something goes wrong and liability arises and you look up to your insurer, the insurer will definitely tell you, we didn't cover volunteers, we only covered employees. So this is not advice that we can specifically give, that is general to applicable to each and everyone's situation. But if you contact your insurance carrier and explain your circumstances and your agency and the type of project that you're undertaking within the community, then the insurance carrier can give you a better advice on what kind of insurance you actually require. If there is a requirement for an audit within the grant agreement, for example, if the grantor will carry out an audit to ensure or to verify that actually you've used the funds properly, then it's important that you get ready and prepare yourself, prepare the records, and ensure that those records can actually withstand scrutiny, because an audit is basically to verify that you've done what was supposed to be done, and therefore you need to have the records to support your position. So to be prepared for an audit, you need to probably have the following. You need to ensure that you understand the grant agreements and the audit requirements. You maintain organized and detailed records. You maintain clear documentation for expenses, adhere to grant compliance requirements, and it's also advisable that you do an internal audit or review, so that when the external auditor, who is the grantor, comes in, at least you have a basis that you have done your internal review and you're actually satisfied that it will meet, it will withstand the scrutiny from the grantor, if at all he sent some auditors to your organization. So like I mentioned, liability from subcontractors. Sometimes your agency organizations are not able to do the projects themselves, and therefore they do seek, they partner with subcontractors or sub-recipients. But in that way, you are either using grant funds, and you need to be careful that those funds are actually being put to good use or proper use, because the obligation remains on you to satisfy all the requirements of the grant agreement. So even if you bring in a third party, then the grantor will not be really concerned about the third party, but it will be up to the agency organization to vouch and say, we actually brought in a third party, but the third party did the work and did it to our satisfaction. So how do you ensure that you actually get a third party that will not put you in trouble? You have to conduct a thorough due diligence when selecting these subcontractors. Usually you assess their capacity, financial stability, and past performance. Past performance usually indicates what the reputation of that subcontractor. If the past performance has been poor, then it will not be advisable to enter into an agreement with such a contractor. Then, of course, ensure that you execute an agreement. That agreement should express the terms and conditions. It should be able to state the obligations of the subcontractor and the obligations. You should also require, just as you're required at times to take insurance, you should also require that the subcontractors acquire insurance. The reason is these subcontractors also come with liability. So if a subcontractor, for example, committed a tort out there, and depending on the nature of relationship between you and the subcontractor, is the subcontractor your agent, or is the subcontractor an independent contractor? That kind of relationship dictates what kind of liability will arise. Either the liability will come straight to you, or it will stay with the subcontractor. So your relationship is usually specified in the agreement that you sign. And so depending on your circumstance and situation, and also if need be, seeking legal advice would be necessary for you to enter into such kind of arrangement. But also monitoring and oversight over the subcontractor to ensure that they are fulfilling their obligations and complying with the terms of the agreement. If it is necessary, if this is something that is technical, you can provide the necessary training and capacity before you actually contract or during the contract with a subcontractor. Finally, these are some of the additional resources that you can look at to manage your risks and to get to know more about risk management. You can look at Oregon OSHA. There are so many trainings that are available online, for example, on how to handle chainsaws, chippers, and that kind of stuff. You also have dust risk management. Department of Administrative Services has a number of resources available on risk management. We have SAF, and we have the Special Districts Association of Oregon, especially if you're interested in some kind of advice to do with insurance. CSI is also one of those that can provide you with advice on the kind of insurance that you are looking for. And yeah, that is about it. If there are some questions, I'll be happy to take some at this point.
Thank you, Joseph. That's great. There's not any questions in the chat just yet. As people have questions, go ahead and raise your hand. That was a really great overview. I took a few takeaways here just to kind of get us started. So first, I should have said this up at the beginning that this is focused for this presentation, on the CWRR grant in particular, where a lot of these things come up. But as you can tell, this is good advice in general for lots of grants, right? So hopefully this is helpful for you in all kinds of different grants. One of the takeaways I had from just what you were saying is really about planning and tracking. So basically, things are a lot less scary when you do a little bit of planning, and that can be a deliberate meeting to just talk about what are the sorts of risks that we're taking on, how do we manage them, and usually things are quite manageable if you plan ahead. So that's one takeaway, that a part of risk management is also having good records and tracking, just what happened and where was it happening, and that's just good record keeping. We always talk about that with grant management, and just good reminder. That's also part of managing risk. The other thing that I was really thinking about as you were talking was, you have, we are here as a resource. We want everyone to be successful. So if you've run into a challenge, some kind of sticky problem, it looks like it's going to be too big to overcome, and you're thinking about giving up on a project or something like this, there's really no need to suffer in silence, right? Reach out to us if we can talk about it, especially early on, early and often. We are a resource. We can help think about solutions. There are solutions. We can pivot things. So OSFM grants, I'll put in the chat here. This is our email. We're always happy to talk about challenges or whatever's coming up, or you just want to think through a problem or something. And of course, your fire risk reduction specialists out there, your FERS, always good to just keep them in the loop on what's happening, and so that when things come along, it's not news. I heard keeping your eyes on these third-party agreements, these contractors, and also just built into that, having some expectations that they're going to help you document what's happening, so that there's a coherency in documentation, and that's just part of the agreement. That's just good practice. It's a good reminder there. I also just wanted to add, Joseph, you were talking about, the primary document, which is true, is the agreement, the contract. And also, we are using our work plans. as a good place for us to document changes and like risks and updates and all that sort of thing. That's part of the point of those documents. So that's also part of our official, you know, documentation of this stuff. And then lastly, one of the things I took away was, and this is several times come up in our technical assistance with folks, is did you contact your insurer? You know, that's a good first step. Is like sometimes you don't actually know exactly what is covered and what isn't. And so sometimes just having a phone call with your insurance agent and just be like, here's my situation, is this covered or not? And there have been several situations where people, like, they found out, like, oh yeah, you've been paying for that all along. It's totally covered. It's part of the contract. And so sometimes that's just worth it. It's just an initial step just to understand what is there. So I think that was great. Thanks so much, Joseph. Now I see a hands up, and then we got some questions in the chat. So I think Kelsey has her hand up. Kelsey, can you unmute?
Thank you, Joseph, so much for this webinar. So appreciate you. One of the things I wanted to reiterate was the capture of communications for grants, because that's part of the documentation. And the reason I bring that up is because I have a few grants for my region as a fire risk reduction specialist that have temporary positions and have created temporary email addresses for those positions, and to think about how to make sure you archive the emails in a way that are accessible for record keeping in the future. Just wanted to reiterate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelsey. Yeah, it's important that we keep all communications, especially when we know that they will have an impact. Sometimes they may not, but you just never know when a dispute will arise and you'll need to refer to that communication that you deleted 2 days ago. So it's important that you keep it safely, and especially until the grant, the requirements of the grant are fulfilled.
And we have a question from John in the chat, and yeah, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer it at this moment, but I wonder if someone on the call might be able to answer it. I don't know, but what are typical costs for insurance coverage of volunteers? In other words, a year's worth of coverage for a dozen high school kids or church members helping to haul away piles of cut limbs and brush. I know a lot of our partners out there do have that kind of insurance. So if anyone has, you know, their own personal experience, if they want to share it, you can. I don't know, Joseph, if we might need to point to a specific resource at this point.
We may not be able to give an actual figure, because you have to receive a quotation and you have to explain what kind of activity you're undertaking and how many volunteers you have and for how long. And so I think the Special District Association or CSI Oregon would be able to provide the specifics of how much you might actually incur in getting that kind of insurance. But it's quite hard for us to give you a figure.
Or one of your local partners might know as well. Just to gut check, you know, hey, what insurance do you use and how much is it? It might be a good place to go. I see Pam, your hand is up. Are you able to unmute?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, your audio is good.
Cool. So I'm with a small Firewise community in Northeast Oregon, and we have 3 years of funding to do fuels reduction work around properties. And so we had our first year already. So Chris Paul is our OSFM contact, and he's been great. So whenever we need to like change something up, we just call Chris, and he takes it upstairs and then gets it approved or not. And so I really liked all of Joseph's comments. Those are, you know, you've got to have paper copies of all the stuff that you did the conversations that you had. We keep really good track of all the money that we've spent. And so when the time comes to wrap this thing up, we're going to have all our documentation. Our risk in terms of, we hired Northwest Youth Corps to do the work. So basically they have the insurance to cover the people that are on the ground to do the work. So yeah, I really you covered all those points and that we're actually doing it right. So we're excited, and yeah, thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Pam. Yeah, we appreciate the work that you're doing. It's very important to the communities, and we would want to help in as much as we can, and if we can simplify life to ensure that we achieve these goals together, then so be it.
Yep. And we hear from Chris a lot, so he's doing good stuff out there. Thanks. Let's see. Lynn, let's see. Okay, so another comment. Hillary just contributed. I think there's a lot of fear around asking insurers questions. Yeah, that's been our experience as well. And like, you're their customer. They really nothing to fear. They want to help. So that's really been beneficial for a lot of people in some specific situations this last year. It's just like, talk to your insurance agent and they're just, happy actually to do something like as far as interacting with a customer. So they're usually quite responsive. And then
I think that
go ahead.
You shouldn't really fear asking questions, because the worst that could happen is you could receive a quotation from the insurance company and it's big and you say no. The answer may be not what you really wanted, but there's no liability from asking a question about your insurance. Just go ahead and ask the question and get all the answers and have the information to enable you and take that decision.
Yeah, worst case scenario, they try to sell you something else, right? It's like, yeah, we don't cover that, but we could, and here's it is. So it's worth asking. Michelle adds, like personal insurance, shop around and get more than one quote to ensure you're getting similar ranges. Yeah, that's good advice. Let's see, Robert asks, Lynn County uses SAFE for insurance for our volunteers. Oh, okay. There is specific coding through SAFE for volunteers. Oh, I didn't realize SAFE did volunteer covers. Thanks for adding that, Robert. Really appreciate it. All right, we have a bit more time. Any other questions? Some of this stuff is, when you sit down and you start talking about risk, you start getting into some specific definitions of things. But it's manageable. You just got to start breaking them down. So any other questions about any of the slides or topics we didn't cover, or reactions? Anybody want to share a story or experience around insurance? Can we get a copy of the slide presentation? Yes, so this was being recorded. And our plan is to post it here in the next couple weeks. So.
And Sean, if you're willing to entertain the question, I would love to hear from any of the recipients. What are some other workshops that they need? What are they experiencing, and is there something else that we can offer? It's our goal to just keep supporting them with these workshops. So if there's any input there, that would be good too.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. Yeah, we're creating workshops based on the feedback we're hearing. So this came out of a direct, several direct needs and challenges that we were hearing. So if anyone has any of those thoughts, that would be great. Any questions around, the third parties and agreements, any of these things?
That is comforting because then it means
You covered
my
everything.
presentation was simple.
It's like totally comprehensive.
But I mean, on a general overview, I feel like sometimes people think risk is so complicated a thing to deal with. But I mean, just take it like an ordinary thing that happens in your life. Every time you walk out of your house, you experience a number of risks that some of them you have an idea. For example, you're going to be driving and you don't know what will happen on the road. And some of them you have no idea. But if you plan ahead, if, for example, before you get into your car, of course, it's legally required that you should have insurance. But I mean, if you decided to enter your car without insuring it, then it means you have accepted the risk, as simple as that. That whatever happens, you deal with it. And so the same happens with these grants. Look at them as what kind of project are you undertaking, and what risks does this project pose to my organization, to my employees? If, for example, you're using chainsaws, let's take an example of chainsaws or chippers or whatever. Who is operating them? Are they trained to handle such kind of equipment? Do they have protective gear?
Right.
Are they volunteering all their employees? Okay, and so, or are you hiring somebody to actually do that work? Maybe an independent contractor. And what is your arrangement? What is your agreement with that subcontractor that you're hiring? Are you saying you deal with this stuff, whatever happens, if you're injured or whatever, I really don't want to know, but make sure that you do my work? Or are you saying, I am going to give you the chainsaw, I'll be supervising you, from 8 to 9, this is what you're supposed to be doing, this is how you're supposed to cut it, and and so then you're controlling the person and you're making them your employee, and whatever happens to them, you're responsible for them.
Yeah.
But if you say you are independent, do it on your own. So like the agreement that you undertake with that third party should be clear on what kind of arrangement you have with them, and look at the risks that will come. I mean, if you bring an independent party and he commits a tort, does that liability come to you or it stays with them? Right. Because the tort is a risk and a suit is a risk that will definitely come out of a tort claim. So you need to think about them in a basic way. What do I do? What do we do as an organization? What did we propose that we are going to do? And what does our project, what risks does it face? And when it comes, we have received the funds, but are we managing them well? Can we account if, for example, the grantor came in today and said, give me the records of what you've been doing today. Have you been maintaining records? Or you spend funds and you just move on. You cannot actually leave any trail behind. And so it gets complicated. And then it gets hard for you to get more funding.
Yeah, right. And so we have another question in the chat, and just to kind of add on what you're saying there, is like, I think sometimes there are people are used to kind of handshake deals out there about getting some work done. And I think, just the idea that, when you're dealing with these kinds of funds, it's worth having a written agreement. Sometimes that actually has these things like really deliberately spelled out and so on. So that's just something to think about. Now, John says, how do we know if the third-party contractors are still bonded and insured? What if their coverage lapses during the life of the contract?
So we know that insurance, normally, you take out insurance for about a year, and so you have to renew annually. And so before you sign an agreement with the third party, just like before you signed an agreement with OSFM, there are certain requirements that were listed for you to undertake, and one of them was insurance. But also there is a clause that tells you that you must provide the certificate of your renewal annually, and that if anything happens, you are supposed to inform us of any changes in your insurance. So your agreement with the subcontractor can cover all those situations. State that you, for example, before you execute the agreement, you need to see certain documents, including an insurance certificate. 2, if it does actually, if there's any change in your insurance, you are required to inform us. And that way, if it lapses during the lifetime of the contract, they will still inform you. But the other third way is to require that you are included as an insured on that certificate, so that if there is any change in the certificate, you will know. The insurer will inform you in that sense. So there are about 3: contractual, but also you can ensure that you are added as an added, it's called additional insured on that certificate.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, I think we're out of time. Thanks so much for doing this, Joseph. This has been great. And if anyone has any additional questions, please send it our way. OSFM grants, and of course, keep your FERS involved. And thanks for being here. And we'll see you at the next technical assistance webinar and workshop in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Sean, for having me, and thank you for everyone who created time to be here with us.
Michelle.